After the funeral, Laura stepped into her childhood home in Portland with a numb sense of duty. The house felt colder than she remembered, every hallway filled with the heavy silence of absence. Her father moved slowly through the rooms, speaking little, grief stiffening his every gesture. Laura offered to sort through her mother's belongings, thinking it might give both of them some closure. Boxes lined the upstairs hallway, most of them filled with clothes, books, and carefully labeled holiday decorations. Her mother had always been methodical, even in the way she stored memories. The attic, however, was a different story. Dust clung to the wooden beams like cobwebs, and the light bulb above flickered as Laura pulled the chain. She moved aside an old sled, a broken lamp, and a stack of yearbooks before noticing a box in the corner that didn't match the others. It was smaller, sealed with yellowing duct tape, and marked with a faint handwriting that stopped her breath. "Only after my death," it said in blue ink, the letters shaky but unmistakably her mother's. Laura hesitated. It felt invasive to open something so clearly meant for a specific moment, and now that moment had arrived. She carried the box to her apartment that evening. It sat untouched on the kitchen table for hours while she made tea, rearranged the bookshelf, turned on the news, then muted it. Finally, close to midnight, she peeled away the tape. Inside were several VHS tapes, each labeled with a date ranging from 1994 to 2002. A few were marked with vague titles. August, After the Storm, Don't Forget. At the bottom lay an old camcorder, the same one her parents had used to film birthdays and camping trips in her childhood. Laura connected the device to her TV, her fingers trembling as she loaded the first tape. The screen buzzed with static before settling into an image that stole the air from the room. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, back straight but visibly tense, her fingers intertwined tightly in front of her. The kitchen looked unchanged, the same pale wallpaper, the ceramic fruit bowl still visible on the counter. Her mother leaned slightly toward the camera, her eyes flickering with uncertainty and quiet resolve. Then she began to speak, and Laura watched, frozen, as the past came alive. The second tape loaded with a soft mechanical whir, and the screen flickered into color. This time, the setting was unfamiliar. Laura saw her mother seated on a worn sofa in what looked like a rustic cabin. The lighting was dim, a fire crackling off-screen, casting soft shadows on the wooden walls. A moment later, another woman entered the frame. A stranger, older than Laura, with short dark hair and a calm, serious face. She sat beside her mother with practiced ease, their hands finding each other without hesitation. The camera angle was fixed, but steady, as though set up intentionally to record without interruption. The two women spoke with an intimacy that startled Laura. There were no scripts, no pretenses. They leaned into each other as they talked, shoulders touching, eyes locking in ways that only came from years of shared history. Laughter echoed softly in the small space. Then, as the tape continued, the conversation took a quieter turn. The stranger reached into a drawer and pulled out what looked like a small blanket, faded and worn. Her mother held it to her face, inhaling deeply, and whispered something that was just barely audible over the hum of the recording. A name, perhaps. A memory. Laura watched in stunned silence. Over the next few tapes, the same setting reappeared. The cabin by the lake became a recurring backdrop. Laura's mother always arrived alone, usually at dusk, and stayed until nightfall. Sometimes the two women sat outside, wrapped in coats, watching the water. Other times they remained indoors, drinking tea, their conversations alternating between quiet tears and tender laughter. Laura began to notice small, haunting details. A photograph on the cabin wall showing the two women younger, standing with an infant between them. A journal glimpsed in one woman's lap. A baby's onesie folded on a nearby chair. Then came a tape that changed everything. Her mother sat alone this time, eyes red, voice raw. She looked directly into the lens. The words came slowly, heavy with guilt. She spoke of John, Laura's father, and his inability to forgive, his threats if the truth ever came out. She said she had made mistakes, had chosen safety over honesty. And then, finally, she said it. Laura had a sister, a daughter born in secret, kept away, protected, and hidden from a family that wouldn't have accepted her. Laura paused the tape. Her breath caught somewhere in her chest. The room around her felt distant, like scenery from a dream she couldn't quite control. Hours later, after watching the final moments of the recording, she began searching. Drawers were emptied, boxes opened. She sifted through old documents, photo albums, insurance records. She looked for names she didn't recognize, appointments she didn't remember her mother having. Somewhere in the fragments of the past, she hoped to find a clue. A date. A clinic. A name. Anything that could lead her to the sister she never knew existed. A week after the last cassette, Laura received a call from her mother's attorney. There was one remaining item listed in the will, something not of material value, but of personal importance. At the office, she was handed a worn leather-bound journal, tied shut with a faded ribbon. The cover smelled faintly of lavender, and the pages inside were soft with age, some of them stained with time, others rippled as if touched by tears. It was her mother's handwriting, unmistakable, neat, careful, full of deliberate phrasing. The first entry began in early 1997. As Laura read, a different version of her mother began to emerge, one filled with fear, desperation, and a slow erosion of choice. The entries chronicled a pregnancy kept in secret, a storm of emotions surrounding it, and the mounting pressure from her husband. He had found out, and instead of reacting with understanding, he had responded with threats. The words in the journal were etched with pain. He would ruin her. He would take Laura away. He would ensure the child never existed. The most chilling part was not the threats themselves, but the cold clarity in which her mother described them. There was no dramatization, no hysteria, just a quiet surrender to inevitability. A name appeared several pages later. Abby. It was written small, like a whisper. Her mother described the birth in vague but haunting terms. A clinic, late at night. A woman holding her hand. The sound of the baby's first cry. And then silence. No celebration, no photographs, only documents, signatures, and a car ride home with empty arms. The entry ended with a sentence Laura would read over and over again. I wanted to scream her name, but I wasn't allowed. It wasn't mine to say anymore. Among the journal pages was a reference to a facility, a maternity shelter located in the outskirts of the city, known for handling private adoptions. Laura drove there the next morning, only to find a boarded-up building, its paint peeling, its windows clouded with dust and grime. A rusted sign still hung above the door, barely readable. She asked around the neighborhood and finally tracked down a retired nurse who had worked there in the late 90s. The woman remembered the night. A young mother, a premature baby girl. Adoption papers signed quickly, under pressure. The nurse said the father wasn't present, but someone else was. Someone who claimed to be acting on behalf of the family. The records, she admitted, were never properly archived. Some had been destroyed in a purge years earlier. Others, she suspected, had been deliberately removed. Laura pressed for more, but the nurse offered only this. The baby had been adopted in early 1998. A closed case. No forwarding information. No access to the file without court order. Laura thanked her, though her thoughts churned with something darker. Back home, she sifted through her father's old files, his storage cabinets, his handwritten ledgers. Now every receipt, every document, every sealed envelope took on new meaning. It wasn't just concealment, it was control. She remembered his silences, his insistence on protecting the family's name, and for the first time, she realized her mother hadn't simply lost a daughter. She had been forced to surrender her. A name that was once forbidden now echoed in Laura's thoughts, like an unanswered question. Abby, her sister, somewhere out there, raised by strangers, believing a different story. And Laura, now standing at the edge of a truth too long buried, felt both rage and resolve grow inside her. The past was no longer just memory. It was evidence. Laura spent a rainy afternoon on the floor of her father's study, surrounded by dust-covered boxes filled with family albums. The pages creaked as she turned them, each photograph a frozen moment from her childhood. Birthdays, holidays, vacations, each carefully captioned in her mother's neat handwriting. The images felt familiar, but distant, like fragments from a dream she was no longer sure had been real. She was about to close the third album when she paused. Nestled between two ordinary summer snapshots was a photograph she had never seen before. In it, her mother stood on a dock near a lake, arms wrapped protectively around a young girl. The child couldn't have been older than 6, with dark hair and a guarded expression. Laura stared at the photo, her heart suddenly racing. The dock looked familiar. The trees in the background, the pale blue house barely visible across the water. All of it matched a place from vague childhood memories. But it wasn't Laura in the photo. It wasn't anyone she remembered. And yet her mother's posture, the way she leaned in, the softness in her eyes, it was the way she had once held Laura. She studied the back of the photograph. There was no date, no note, just the faded outline of an old adhesive where it had once been stuck in a different album. That night, Laura combed through her mother's handwritten journals again, searching for any mention of a lake house. The word crescent appeared in the margin of one page, next to a note about the summer of 2003. She searched the name online and found a small lake community 3 hours north of Portland, where families rented cabins or kept modest vacation homes. The following weekend, Laura drove out to Crescent Lake. The roads narrowed as she left the city behind, the pine trees thickening until they pressed against the highway on both sides. She found the house from the photo at the end of a winding gravel drive, still pale blue, though the shutters were now faded and one of the porch steps sagged with rot. A woman in a red jacket was unloading groceries from a car parked in the driveway. Laura didn't approach. Instead, she circled the area on foot, eventually speaking with an older couple next door who sat on their porch sipping iced tea. When she showed them the photo, they exchanged a long glance. Yes, they remembered the girl. Her name had been Abigail. She used to spend weekends there with a guardian, a quiet older woman with gray-streaked hair. They weren't family, not officially, but they were close. The woman passed away a few years back, and Abigail hadn't been seen since. Laura thanked them and returned to her car, her thoughts spinning. That evening, she sat on her couch with her laptop open, scrolling through social media profiles, following threads of names and faces. She filtered by location, age, photos with similar features. Finally, she found one. Abigail Hartley. The profile picture showed a woman in her late 20s, standing by a hiking trail. There was something in the shape of her jaw, the slope of her eyebrows, the quiet intensity in her expression that mirrored Laura's own reflection. Her hands trembled as she clicked through more photos. It wasn't just resemblance. It was lineage. Laura typed a message, erasing and retyping it more than once, before finally pressing send. She kept it short, vague, cautious. Within minutes, a reply appeared. The tone was blunt, almost defensive. 4 words. Who are you and why? Laura stared at the screen, her breath shallow. The question lingered like a challenge. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was the beginning of something irreversible. They met at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, neutral ground where neither past nor memory held sway. Laura arrived early, heart pounding, scanning each face that entered. When Abigail finally walked in, Laura recognized her immediately. The same guarded stance, the same sharp curiosity behind her eyes. They looked at each other for a long moment before sitting down, the silence between them thick with unsaid questions. Their resemblance was undeniable, but the distance between their experiences made each word feel fragile. The conversation began carefully, filled with pauses and fragmented thoughts. Abigail remained stiff, skeptical, her tone edged with disbelief and something darker: resentment. Laura had brought a flash drive. She didn't try to explain. She simply slid it across the table and asked her to watch it. That night, Abigail came to Laura's apartment. They sat side by side in silence as the video played on the TV. The footage was grainy, the color faded. Laura's mother appeared in frame, sitting at the same kitchen table as in the earlier tapes, but this time her posture was different. Defeated, quieter, as though the weight of years had finally broken through. She spoke slowly, carefully, her voice nearly cracking. She recounted the moment she learned she was pregnant with Abigail, the joy, the terror, and then the pressure from John. She described his betrayal, his coldness, the ultimatum he gave her: choose silence and keep her family, or speak the truth and lose everything. Abigail sat motionless, hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable as the recording unfolded. When the tape ended, she didn't speak. Only after several minutes of stillness did she wipe a tear from her cheek, her expression fractured by grief and something deeper: recognition. Laura said nothing. She understood that pain needed room. Eventually, Abigail whispered that she had never known the truth. She had believed the story told to her, that her birth mother had abandoned her, uninterested, unwilling. The weight of that lie pressed down on them both. The next day, they returned to the family house together. The air inside felt different now, no longer a tomb of silence, but a chamber of unsealed memory. Laura brought out the last tape, one she had intentionally saved. They sat in the living room, the lights dimmed, the box of tapes open beside them like a vault finally unlocked. The screen flickered to life. Their mother looked directly into the lens, her eyes raw with sorrow but steady. She spoke not to the camera, but to them. She said that if they were watching, it meant they had found each other. Her voice trembled as she admitted the truth that had chased her for decades. John had known the child wasn't his. He had given her an impossible choice, and she had chosen survival, at the cost of her daughter's presence. In her final words, she asked for forgiveness she felt she hadn't earned. She begged them not to let the pain pass silently into the next generation. Then, with a trembling breath, she asked them to destroy the cassette, to burn it, not out of shame, but as a ritual of closure. But more importantly, she urged them to speak, not to hide, not to perpetuate silence. When the screen faded to black, the room was still. They didn't speak for a while after. They just sat there, two women bound by a history neither had written, but both had inherited. Laura placed the tape back in its case. Whether or not they would burn it, she didn't yet know. But for the first time in years, the silence between them didn't feel like distance. It felt like beginning. They chose a neutral space, a private room in a quiet community center, far from the house where the truth had been buried. Laura arrived first, the cassette case clutched tightly in her hand. Abigail followed a few minutes later, composed but pale. When their father walked in, his steps slowed at the sight of them together. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, then confusion, then something colder: fear. He greeted them cautiously, scanning the room as if hoping this was all a misunderstanding. But the silence between the three of them was dense, waiting to break. Laura placed the tape in the small television setup they had arranged. No explanations, no questions. Just the slow push of the play button. The screen filled with their mother's face again. Tired, aging, but resolute. Her voice filled the room, steady and devastating. She spoke of the past, of John's ultimatum, of her own helplessness. She spoke of silence and sacrifice. She confessed what had never been spoken aloud in that family: that Abigail existed, that Laura had a sister, that he had known. He watched without interruption, his face stiffening with each passing minute. When the tape ended, he remained seated, his hands folded between his knees. He didn't speak at first. Then the words came, hesitant, wrapped in a tone that sounded like regret. He claimed he had done it to protect them, to preserve their life, to protect the family from the chaos truth might bring. But his voice lacked conviction. The weight of the tape had already unraveled the excuses he had held onto for decades. Laura listened without emotion. Abigail stared at the floor, jaw clenched. Neither of them believed that protection had been the motive. It had been fear, control, image. Their mother had suffered for it. Abigail had been erased, and Laura, raised in a lie, had inherited only a shadow of the truth. When they stood to leave, their father remained in the chair, staring ahead, as if the walls around him had silently collapsed. Days later, the sisters filed a petition in court to formally acknowledge their familial bond. DNA tests confirmed what the tapes had already made clear. The court documents marked the end of one story and the beginning of another. A local newspaper picked up the case after the filing. The article was small, but the headline carried weight. Long-lost sisters reunited after decades of silence. In the weeks that followed, Laura and Abigail returned to the family house one final time. They brought with them a box of tapes, a bottle of wine, and a quiet sense of resolve. They sat on the floor of the living room, the curtains open, letting in the afternoon light. One by one, they watched the tapes again, not as evidence, but as memories. Their mother's voice no longer haunted the space. It softened it, made it whole. They didn't cry. They listened. They remembered. They let the past move through them without breaking them. In that room, surrounded by years of silence finally lifted, they smiled. Not for what had been taken, but for what they had reclaimed. Each other. The truth, and the right to decide what came next.